You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. How are you?
Doing good.
It's the new year, so...
Oh, it is, and it's my favorite month of the year.
Yeah, actually, your birthday's in a few days.
Yep.
So I won't tell our listeners when, but I think you've been talking about this since December, that January is your birthday month that you celebrate.
Absolutely. So, all month long.
People like myself, my birthday's right after the 4th of July, and it's not a big deal.
And I just choose to celebrate your birthday all month long, too, for you.
Anyhow, so last week we talked about radon because it is Radon Awareness Month. And for our listeners that are new or newer, we typically talk about other things besides mold just because it's important when it comes to indoor air quality. And radon's one of those things. And being that it's Radon Awareness Month, we're going to talk about radon again. So our listeners hear us talk about mold mitigation all the time, but today's topic is radon mitigation. Do you have any idea what it is, what it entails?
No idea, because radon, like mold, is naturally occurring. Right?
Yes.
And so when I think of mitigation with radon, I'm like, how exactly do you mitigate something that is in the air that way?
Right. To kind of cover that just a little bit, when we talk about mold being naturally present in the air, there are mold species, mold types, like Stachybotrys, Fusarium, Chaetomium. They're not normally in a home. Does that make sense?
Okay.
The reason that they're a concern is because they got building materials wet. So sheetrock, insulation, things like that, that's what makes those molds toxic.
What makes radon toxic to the point where it needs to be mitigated?
So radon is naturally present. So when we test, just to kind of backtrack a little bit for our listeners, when you test and you do it professionally, so we have 2 CRMs. I used to have 3, but...
And CRM stands for?
Continuous Radon Monitors.
CRM, okay, got it.
That's the professional way to test. So any of our listeners that have had a radon test done professionally, hopefully they had it done with a CRM, which is an expensive machine. You've seen that. To kind of lead into the whole Luft thing, Sun Radon is who manufactures the Luft. The reason I came across that indoor air quality monitor was through Sun Radon. My radon machines are Sun Radon. Well, one of them is.
Mm-hmm. But that's not the charcoal thing that people can go to the public health department and get for free.
Exactly.
So what's the difference in the ability to test with the little charcoal kit thing versus a CRM?
So a CRM, once again, that's the professional way to do it. It's a machine, depending on which machines you have. One of the machines that I have is probably a $4,000 machine. The other machine I have, you can probably buy it for $1,500. But what what a CRM does is it monitors, it's a machine that you have to go set up in the home. It monitors and records the radon levels every hour.
Okay.
Versus a charcoal canister, and I'm looking up because I thought maybe I'd have one in here, but it's literally this, I'm not sure what size that would be, but just a little bit bigger than a mason jar size. That's activated charcoal. And what's in there is you just take the cover off when you set it up, and you literally just leave it sitting out in the open. In that charcoal canister, it has at the bottom a little plastic dish in there. And what the radon does is it somehow, and this is way beyond my expertise, it somehow leaves marks in that plastic. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Because it's a gas, it does something to that charcoal canister. And those that understand this are probably laughing listening to me because this is way out of my expertise. The charcoal canister, you literally open it up, you leave it sitting there for 4 days, you put the top back on, you put electrical tape around the seam, you send it to a lab, AccuStar, I can't remember all the other brands, but you send it to a lab, they analyze it, and then they tell you what the radon levels are in your home. So if you think about that compared to a machine, and you've seen my machines, they have a digital screen on them. They're kind of high tech. Those have several things. You have to plug them in so they have power. They have a battery backup. Plus, when I was doing radon testing all the time was when I was doing home inspections. So we wanted to know, when I'm doing a radon test for my client, that's typically the buyer. Well, the buyer's not living in the home. How does my client know if the seller's tampering with our machine? A CRM has sensors in it. So if it gets moved, if it gets unplugged, it tells us that.
Okay.
Go back to the charcoal canister. How do you know if it got moved?
You don't.
And I actually had, and I think I've told you this before, I actually had several sellers that actually were moving my CRM. And the way I knew that is I would set up the monitor an hour or two after I leave. I'd have a power failure, and then I would have a movement sensor. Once again, remember, it's recording every hour. And I don't tell all this stuff to the sellers, so they're not aware of it. I come back, let's say 4 days later, I print off my report and it would show that it got moved 2 hours after I left and there was a power failure. So I know it was unplugged. Then 2 hours before I get back to pick it up, the same thing happened.
Okay, gotcha.
So the evidence shows they moved it.
So literally, it's much better to do a long-term test using...
No. CRM's a short-term test.
Oh, okay, so both the charcoal and the CRM are short-term tests.
Yes.
Because they're only over...
It's a real estate transaction.
Or a certain number of days?
Yes. So we talked about this, I believe, in the last episode. Maybe we didn't dive that deep into it. But so when we do radon testing, there's two different types. You can do a short-term test or a long-term test.
Okay.
So keep this in mind. We're doing this as a home inspector when someone's buying a home. We don't have 90 days to leave a machine, nor would I leave a machine there for that long. We don't have that amount of time.
Okay.
So we do what's called a short-term test. We test under what's called closed home conditions, meaning they cannot run ceiling fans, they can't run a fireplace, they can't open windows. We're testing.
Can they run the AC?
Yes.
Okay.
If it's not, once again, that varies too. But what we're trying to do is we're capturing the highest levels that the people in the home would ever be exposed to.
Okay.
So that's why we do a short-term test. Once again, it's a real estate transaction. We don't have months to do a proper test. That's why we're doing it that way.
Okay.
So to answer your question, your charcoal canister and the CRM are both short-term tests. Now, you use a canister to do a long-term test.
Oh, okay. And how long is long-term? Are we talking months or weeks?
Over 90 days.
Okay, so a long-term radon test is over 90 days. A short-term radon test is anything below 90 days.
Exactly.
And so
it's typically only 4 days.
So if somebody is considering radon mitigation, should they have had the long-term, or is the short-term testing enough to say, hey, you need mitigation?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Okay.
and I laugh about it. But per my certification standards, you're supposed to do a long-term test.
Oh, wow.
And the reason why is so going back to the two different types. You have a short-term test under closed home conditions. Then you do a long-term test. There are no closed home conditions. You can open your windows, do whatever you would normally do.
Okay.
In my opinion, that's a better test because it's more accurate as to what you're going to be exposed to.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, that's what we want to know. For the realtors that are listening, they're going to be like, no, Steve, you're wrong. You shouldn't do a long-term test. How do you do that if we're trying to sell a home? There's ways around that. You can get a bid for what a radon mitigation system would cost. You put that in escrow, you close on the home. Now, my client who hired me initially to do the radon test is living there. There's no reason that they would want to skew the numbers. So they're not going to tamper with the testing canister. At whatever point it works for them, you can do a long-term test. You put the money in escrow for the mitigation. Let's say it's $5,000. We do a long-term test. If it still comes back high, the money's in escrow. So nobody's really controlling it except for the escrow company. Whoever does the mitigation system does it, gets paid for it. If the long-term test comes back fine, then the escrow money, the $5,000, $4,000, how much ever was in there, goes back to the seller. Make sense?
Okay, it makes sense. What I'm not understanding, though, is when I think of mold mitigation, I think of somebody hiring a mold expert, a mold mitigation company to come and take care of the mold to mitigate it. But I'm hearing you mention with radon mitigation purchasing a system. So how exactly does radon mitigation work? Are you hiring an expert to come in?
Well, yeah,
Are
you should.
Purchasing a system? Is the system doing everything? How does it all work, radon mitigation?
So just to be clear, when we're doing mold remediation, we have mold infestations that we can visibly see.
Mm-hmm.
We're removing that. Mold has to be physically removed. Whereas radon doesn't have to be physically removed. Well, it does, but this is where it gets complicated. The radon isn't something growing on your wall. No. It's just naturally in the air.
It's in the air.
So more or less, you need better ventilation.
Okay. Is that what you mean by a radon mitigation system?
Yes.
Better ventilation system?
Yeah.
Okay.
So depending on the layout of the home, if it's a crawl space, we rarely see high radon in a crawl space if it's ventilated properly. Now, once again, if it's not ventilated properly, then you can just add better ventilation, retest. If it's a conditioned crawl space, so it's got waterproofing, it's all sealed up, then you would install a radon mitigation system, which is literally an exhaust fan, but it's a lot more expensive.
Okay.
Make sense?
That does make
That's
sense.
in a crawl space. Okay. Now, if we did radon mitigation in the home we live in, so for our listeners, we have a 3-level home. We have a basement, which is full basement. We have our main level, and then we have our second level. Radon is always highest in the lowest level. Mm-hmm. So if we did radon mitigation in this home, it's already pre-plumbed. So they have what's called a passive radon mitigation system. It's literally a pipe that runs from one side of the house to the other side.
Okay.
And on top of that, I'm not sure what they did because I didn't build it. But then they put another type of mitigation system in, meaning they piped it, which is literally a 4-inch pipe that comes out of the ground in the mechanical room. You literally put a radon fan in there that either runs constantly or runs on a timer. You pipe that fan to the exterior. It's supposed to terminate above the roof line. And that's how you deal with it. What you're doing is, so in a home like ours, you're pulling all the air from underneath the slab and you're taking it back outside.
Okay.
Make sense?
That does make sense. So then when people are getting radon mitigated, they are having somebody come in and install a ventilation system and to make sure that things are that radon is moving out of the home.
Air, yeah.
The air. And so how much does that cost, though?
It depends. If I just talked about our house, it's all pre-plumbed.
Okay.
The hard part's done, in my opinion. You would literally, like I said, put an inline fan in the mechanical room, pipe it to the exterior, and you're talking, I don't know, $600-$700 for the fan itself, and then maybe another $100 in pipe. So
what if it's
cheap.
an older home, though, that doesn't have everything sort of ready to go? I mean, what are some of the higher price ranges people are looking at?
$8,000,
$8,000. Okay, for radon. Okay, that is.
But I would say on average, your average is probably $3,000, $4,000.
How does somebody know they need radon mitigation? I mean, is it the testing?
Test.
And the testing will say it's off the charts.
Yeah, so when we test for radon, there's two different ways you can test. It's either in working levels or picocurie liters per hour. That's how it's measured. The machines I have are picocurie liters per hour. As long as the average, so it's going to move up and down. It's a gas. So the barometric pressure is going to have a lot to do with what's going on with your radon levels. And it's different. Like our neighbors could have low radon and we could have high radon. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, it all depends, on many different factors, but you would test for it. And like I said, as long as the average is below 4, you're good.
Okay, and so that's below 4. But now, how often should people be testing, and where does the Luft fit into radon testing?
So the Luft monitors 6 different things, and I usually get it right, but I'm not prepared. It measures the radon, temperature, humidity, ECO2, TVOCs, and I'm not sure what the 6th one is now. Carbon monoxide, maybe? I don't think it is that. You would think I would know this, but I wasn't prepared for that question.
But we have that in our home. And I think the reason why I'm asking is because our Luft in our home monitors radon. Do we need to do radon tests? I mean, that's what I'm trying. Somebody might be saying, well, if I buy a Luft,
professionally, okay. I think you should.
Oh, so how often should people, even with a Luft, be doing professional radon testing?
That's where it's a bit complicated, but to go back to your specific question, where our Luft is would not be the proper location for radon levels to be tested.
It should be in the basement.
It should be in the basement.
Okay.
So once again, this is why you hire a professional. On top of that, you're asking somebody that has 2 machines that just sit most of the time. I think I've used those machines 4 or 5 times in the last 8-10 years. So they don't get used. But my point is if you're asking me, do we need to test? Well, yeah, we should, but I have all the equipment. Plus we have the Luft. For our listeners, they should test every other year.
Got it. And they should do both short-term and long-term testing every other year?
Now, once again, the circumstances, if you're just a listener who's testing for your knowledge, I would do a long-term test.
Okay.
If you're selling your home, then you would do a short-term.
Got it. Okay, that's very, very helpful. So what's the biggest thing you want people to take away from this episode on radon mitigation?
Well, we talked about it's a huge difference between radon mitigation and mold mitigation. For mold, we can visibly see a mold problem. Radon, you have to have special equipment to test with it. Just understand that radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer next to smoking. So make sure you do test every other year.
There you go. And what's your call to action for people?
If you have a radon mitigation system, make sure you go check the vacuum indicator on it and make sure it's working properly. If you're listening and you have a radon mitigation system, you will know what that is. It's right there by the fan. It looks like a little J. It has liquid in there, it has blue or red dye in there, and it shows their suction. So pretty simple.
Very good. And get the Luft.
Yes. And I'll put a link for the Luft, but we do have a resource page on our website. So just go to our website, make sure, and I'm pretty sure it's on the far right. Click on that. It'll pull up the Luft. There's a link there. If you buy it through me, because I'm an affiliate, I do provide feedback for 1 year of what your readings are.
Awesome. There you go.
Pretty easy. So we thank all of you for listening and have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.